Welcome back, everyone who's been here yesterday, and special welcome to anyone who couldn't make it yesterday. And apologies that some of us may look a little bit droopy-eyed. It was a very long day yesterday, very full, very wonderful, and it was a long evening as well. The first topic this morning is one that really fascinates me. I'm one of those readers who came to historical fiction at the same time as reading Tolkien, same time as being fascinated with the Arthur myth cycle, the Mabinogion, classical and folk myths. There's always a crossover to me in historical fiction and folklore. And I regard the folk tale as just as important a feed route to the novel as realism or any of the other ways that you get to the novel. So this panel could actually have been created for my interest. Our host for this talk is Kate Forsyth, who we met briefly yesterday enthusing about our upcoming conference in Sydney, Australia, for which she is kindly the patron. It's the 20th, 21st and 22nd of March, I believe, next year.
Thank you, Richard.
Kate writes several series of books for children, full of adventure, romance, magic and humour. Some are fantasies, some historical fantasies, with fabulous titles like The Cat's Eye Shell, The Butterfly in Amber, or The Puzzle Ring. She's written 2 recent adult novels, The Wild Girl, tale of Wilhelm Grimm and Dortchen Wilde, who told the Brothers Grimm many of their most famous stories, and Bitter Greens, a retelling of the Rapunzel story set in 16th century Venice. Ladies and gentlemen, I hand you over now to Kate Forsyth for Confronting Historical Fact with the Unexplained.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here today, and I feel very privileged to be on this panel of amazing women. I think I've been looking forward to this ever since Richard told me about it. I'd like to begin by asking you all to turn on your phones, because I'm hoping that you will all be taking lots of photographs, and I think you should be tweeting like mad, because the things that are going to come out of this panel are going to be things that the world wants to know. So take out your phones, turn them on. If you do not know, the Twitter hashtag is HNS London 14, I believe that's right. And all of us except for Diana are on Twitter. So if you search our names, we are there. But you can still mention Diana, even though she's still in the past century. All right. I would like to begin by saying, once upon a time, and long, long ago and far, far away, ever since I was a little girl, these are words that had power to enchant me. And as soon as I read them, I'd get that delicious shiver of excitement and anticipation, knowing that what I was about to read was going to transport me somewhere strange, somewhere beautiful, and somewhere perilous. For me, legends, myths, fairy tales, and folklore are the most fascinating part of human history. Long, long, long ago, our ancestors used to crouch around a campfire and they would tell each other stories to keep away the terror of the night. And those stories that they told, those stories of giants and monsters and heroes and gods and quests, those are the stories that shaped the human imagination. And we all carry those stories deeply embedded in our own psyche. We all share them. They're stories of true love and of transformation and triumph. And all of the writers that are sitting here with me today, all of the women sitting here today, draw upon this deep well of story and of symbol and of superstition, and then they transform it through the mysterious alchemy of the imagination into something new and deeply powerful. And so it's my very great pleasure today to be here with them and to be sharing with you the stories of their inspirations and the story of how they have changed and transformed these ancient stories into something that is incredibly new, incredibly fresh, and incredibly human. So I would like to begin by asking them all just to introduce themselves and to talk just a little bit about their work. We will go into deeper detail about their work in just a moment. Dana, I might actually start with you.
Okay, thank you. I should say that I'm not a historical fiction writer. I'm a literary scholar. So I'm coming at this subject from a slightly different angle from the other people on the panel, and I think from probably most people in this room. I started working on historical fiction 10 years ago, I think. No, more than 10 years ago. And I started writing on it because it seemed to me that it had been neglected. And it seemed to me that it had been neglected critically, partly because it was associated with women writers. It was associated with people like Jean Plaidy, for instance, with Georgette Hare, with Anya Satan, with Margaret Irwin, and so on, particularly in the 1950s and 1960s. So it kind of fell out of favour as a serious literary genre. And people didn't teach it in universities, certainly. And it's only recently that it's come back into the academy, come back into the canon. And I think 1990 was a key year from that point of view, with the publication of Possession, A.S. Byatt's Possession, which won the Booker Prize, of course. And that's a parallel narrative novel. And that, I think, is the date when things start to shift and literary critics start to take the historical novel more seriously. I've published two books on historical fiction. The first one was called The Woman's Historical Novel, and that was a kind of political title in that I wanted to draw attention to the fact that this had been a feminized genre. It's a really important genre for women writers and for women readers. So The Woman's Historical Novel was very much a political statement about the importance of this genre to women. And that looked at historical novels throughout the 20th century. It was a slightly insane book to write because it was a survey of women's historical fiction through the 20th century, from 1900 through to 2000. And one of my arguments in that book was that there's a point in the 1920s where women come back to the historical novel in a very serious way, and it's partly to do with the spread of university education, partly to do with the vote, the fact that women start to think of themselves as citizens. Once they have the vote, they start to think about their place in history. How do they fit into history? And they go back and look at history and look at the past. I was also very interested in the 20s in people like Naomi Mitchison, who were using myth and fairy tale to write about history, because the inclusion of myth and legend and fairy tale, in a sense, marks a historical novel out as not fact, and that tension really interests me. So the second book I've written about historical fiction is called Female Gothic Histories, and that was that was an even more insane book to write, because I went right back to the early 18th century, to the start of the genre of both the Gothic and the historical novel. And one of my bugbears is the fact that people tend to talk about Walter Scott as having started the historical novel as a genre, and I believe Richard did that yesterday in a kind of slightly caveated way. And actually there were a lot of people writing historical fiction before Walter Scott. There's a lovely book by Anne Stevens where she looks at a kind of body of historical fiction before Scott. She looks at 85 novels, and there are two novels which are particularly important, one of which I've looked at because it's both the first Gothic novel in many ways, the first female Gothic novel, and one of the first historical novels. And that's Sophia Lee's book, The Recess, which is about the imagined twin daughters of Mary, Queen of Scots. So that's a fascinating novel because it's bringing together all sorts of things and exploring women's place within history. So I'll hand back to Kate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diana. It's such fascinating research. Essie, would you mind...
So just a little general introduction?
Yes, just a little introduction we can go into.
Right. I'm Essie Fox. I write historical novels which are based in the Victorian era, and although they do tend to stick quite rigidly to that structure, what you might almost call pastiche, because I think it's very hard to write a genre such as Victorian fiction when you're using the language of the era and you're using those settings and those clothes which aren't interchangeable. You do have to stick with that, otherwise it would not be a true novel. But as well as writing in that era, I do try to bring in certain ideas of fairy tale elements or myths or legends or even stories that are supposed to be true but perhaps have different truths to them, but they all have one certain truth, which is that about life, death, love, ultimate faith. And how I came to write originally, I don't quite really know how I came to have this passion for writing Victorian novels as such, but I did used to work in publishing. When I first left university, I worked in publishing, and at that time I worked for Allen & Unwin, who no longer exist as Allen & Unwin in this country, but they used to publish Tolkien and the works of Tolkien and lots of other fantasy fiction. And although I don't write fantasy, I do find that those fantastical elements have influenced me. I left the world of publishing quite soon because I got pregnant, I had a daughter, and then I worked for about 20 years in art and design. But I do think that, that painting pictures with pencils and crayons and paints is not that different in a way to writing a novel, particularly if you want to convey an image and a look. And I often think that writing is a little bit like painting a picture, that you want to convey the look, but also the feeling, and you want to appeal to the senses. And that's very important to me. And I do find that appealing to the physical senses and the psychological excitement of myths, fairy tales, and legends is also important. So that's a very wide basis of what I do, and I'll let you move on.
Thank you so much, Jessie. I have to say that I've read the first two of Essie's books, and I absolutely love them. That's how Essie and I met, because I wrote to her saying, I've just finished reading your books, I love them so much.
Thank you.
I might start with you now, Deb, if you wouldn't mind.
So I'm Deborah Harkness, and I am, I guess, a little bit of an oddity in that I am a professor of history at the University of Southern California, and I wrote 2 historical monographs before I ever wrote any kind of fiction. And my fiction is a bit hard to classify in that it has fantastic elements and science fiction elements and also historical elements. The most recent, I've written a trilogy called the All Souls Trilogy. The first book was A Discovery of Witches. The second book was Shadow of Night, and the third book just came out a few months ago, I guess now, called The Book of Life. And, you know, I think for me, I'm a historian of Europe from 1400 to 1800, and I am confronted every day in my job with the limits of history, with what history cannot do. And that's one of the things that I try to convey to my students is, you know, just exactly how limiting a fact is. It doesn't actually do much for you. It's all about the interpretation. It's all about figuring out motivation. It's all about figuring out character. It's about figuring out, you know, what causes someone to do what they do. And the thing that I try to develop the most in my students and in my classroom is what I call historical empathy, which is an ability to look back at people in the past and to understand them without judging them. Now, this is partly because I am a historian of, you know, you sort of, with history, what you actually do is this minute little end of a funnel. You know, so I start by saying I'm a professor of European history between 1400 to 1800. Then I go down and I say, well, actually, I'm a sort of cultural and intellectual historian. And then if people haven't fallen asleep at that point, I say, I'm actually a historian of science and medicine. And if they're still with me, I say, and I mostly work in the 16th century. And then if I get down even further than that, I say, you know, and my specialty is actually looking at the relationship between the occult sciences and what we would call the natural sciences in the 16th century. And at this point, most people have left the room. But anyway, so you know, this is, I think, part of the reason why I'm often really sort of trying to get my students to understand without judging, because I teach the things that lost in the scientific revolution: alchemy, astrology, magic, Kabbalah, all of the things that, you know, sort of draw on those mythic traditions. And so when I turned to fiction, it was not planned, but it was a wonderful adventure in, again, sort of exploring that place where history stops, where facts, I guess, not history, where fact stops, and where the imagination and interpretation have to begin. And I think from that point, actually, that, you know, writers of historical fiction and historians have an awful lot more in common than anyone is actually really willing to think about. Because really, I hate to tell you this, but historians really are writing fiction most of the time. And so it was, sort of a great relief to me to now find myself at the Historical Novel Society conference and not at the American Historical Association, where I have to sort of say different things. So I'm going to stop there and we'll come back to things later.
Thank you so much, Deb. Jessie?
Hello, I'm Jessie Burton, and I've written one novel called The Miniaturist, which is out now. And just very briefly, it's set in 1686 and over 3 months of a time period, and it tells the story of a young girl, a young bride who is gifted a doll's house, which is a miniature version of their marital home by her new husband. And I suppose the sort of unexplained element of my book is that the house starts replicating her real life and actually presaging events in her real life, or so she thinks. And I was just thinking about where I may have kind of been inspired by that, and I think some of my earliest influences were A Traveller in Time by Alison Utley and The Ghost of Thomas Kemp by Penelope Lively, two of my favourite novels. And I think what I was trying to do in the book is, yes, there is this presentation of a historical setting, but it's something what Deb was focusing on. It's, these people were real, and it's not sort of crystalline in how they lived. And I've been experiencing being labelled somewhat by people saying, oh, you're a historical fiction, you're a magic realist, you're a feminist fiction, and it's all of these things and none of these things. It is essentially a story, but I do identify some of my influences. And I suppose one thing that I have been concerned with in the book is about perception, what you see when you see something that you need to see in order to carry on, in order to tell your own story, and proportion. So obviously with this sort of the dolls essentially not coming to life, but are they or are they not? But there's this idea of how much you can control your life and how much is out of your control, and that grey area, that liminal space which you explore as a novelist of what is real and what isn't real, and does it matter? Thanks.
Thank you so much. I thought I'd start actually with you, Deb. I read A Discovery of Witches in Germany, staying at the Sleeping Beauty Castle in Saberburg. Incredibly atmospheric place to stay. It was very cold, and I'd been travelling for a long time. I was very tired, and I went to bed on a rain-washed day, and I read your book in one great gulp, and I loved it. And it felt so atmospheric. And I would very much like to ask you, the dreaded question that authors hate to be asked the most. You know what it is, isn't it?
No.
Well, the question is, where did you get your idea from? But I would very much be interested in knowing your very first inspirations for this story and what began it for you.
I was in an airport in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, and it was first week of September of 2008. And I walked through the airport, and there was an enormous wall of books about witches, vampires, shapeshifters, werewolves, elves, fallen angels, trolls, you name it. And I was utterly transfixed. I had just published the year before, my second monograph, which is academic shorthand for I hadn't gotten out much in the previous 3 years. And I thought, what happened while I was in the library? Because there was this wall, and what struck me about it was that would have been ideal reading material for my research subjects in 1550. They would have loved that wall of books. And we don't usually think of ourselves as having all that much in common with someone who lived in 1550. And I couldn't let go the question, why are we still so fascinated with these creatures? Because what I tell my students, again, is that, in the 1550s, people were fascinated because they had a worldview that supported the real existence of these creatures. Their science supported the notion these creatures could exist. but we don't necessarily have that same worldview. So why can't we let these creatures go? And based on the covers of the books that I saw, none of which I'd read, it looked to me very odd in that it looked as though witches were very excited to be witches in these books. Now, historically speaking, this has not been an ideal career path for women. And so I really did start thinking, if these creatures really exist, as these books seem to suggest they do around us, I started thinking like a historian of science. How does that work? What lies do humans have to tell to make them not see them? What lies do those creatures have to tell so that we don't notice them? What do they do for a living? How do they date? All those sorts of things. And that's where the idea came. And I think it really, when I started, I thought maybe I was going to write sort of an op-ed or an essay on the modern preoccupation with these creatures. And then I started, the more I imagined it, the more they took shape as characters, and then suddenly they were talking to each other, and then I started writing down what they were saying, and then I thought, oh, I'm writing a novel. And that was how it happened. So it was, and it really was that kind of, a wonderful, unplanned accident that, sort of you think, oh, fantastic, this is great. And then I did it an hour morning.
Serendipity. I love the way that serendipity works in the creative arts, how it inspires us. Yeah. That's so lovely. Thank you so much. Essie, I might move to you now. I actually picked your book up off the bookshelf, not knowing you or not having heard of you, and I was drawn by the title.
Right, the somnambulist.
Yes, and again, I just devoured your book. I loved it. It's sort of set in this world, this Victorian world that is so vividly brought to life, and I really felt that I was there in those foggy streets with the rattle of the carriage wheels over the cobblestones, and this voyage of discovery that this young woman goes on. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your early inspiration for that book.
Oh, right. Well, that book took me by surprise completely. I mean, talking about serendipity, that really was like serendipity, because I'd been thinking about writing simply because, to be honest with you, I had got rather bored with what I was doing, the design work I was doing. It had become very much so that people wanted me to do the same thing again and again and again. My daughter left home, went to university. I had a lot more time on my own at home. So I was one of those empty nesters, which is a bit of a cliche, really. But I suddenly thought, I have this time on my hand. I'm a little bit bored. What am I going to do? I loved reading, as I'm sure you all do. And what the sort of books I'd been really enjoying at that time were books by Angela Carter. And I loved that sense of fusing historical fiction with magical realism. And I think magical realism, for some people, comes to be a word they do shy away from a little bit, but there's so many different ways of doing it. I mean, the Gothic, my books have been termed as being quite Gothic. And I think the Gothic, in a way, is a sense of that, just honing it into the dark side of that. But it still does have fairy tale elements and all the ideas of the monsters that we are all afraid of, all these innate stories that follow us down through the centuries, really. But I went along one night with my husband, completely out of the blue. We decided to go to a performance of Acis and Galatea, which is an operetta by Handel, at Wilton's Music Hall in East London. It's the oldest music hall. It's still open to the public today. Any of you can go there. They do quite a different range of events. And you walk through these flaking double doors into a flagstoned corridor, and you walk to the end of the corridor. On the right is the bar that used to be the Mahogany Bar, which was actually how it started. And the Mahogany Bar used to have just a function hall at the back, really, where they used to have turns. But then as the music hall world took hold, it was turned into an enormous music hall. And you go in there and you've got brass barley twist pillars. There used to be a massive chandelier, which was the biggest in London. It has it's a very small hall. It's much smaller, about half the size of this, about half the width and the same length. But it has beautiful arched niches, which used to have mirrors. It has a beautiful balcony with a lovely papier-mâché relief on the front of it. And sitting there when the lights went down, and there were just very faint lights glittering on these barley twist pillars, I suddenly thought, what must it have been like in its heyday? when you had all the clatter and the bang and the fighting and shouting and laughing and the prostitutes up in the balcony, and also taking that idea and the idea of this operetta which I was watching, which was totally magical, of Acis and Galatea, which is very shortly a myth about Galatea is a nymph who falls in love with a shepherd boy, Acis, but there is a cyclops, a giant on the island called Polyphemus, and he's in love with Galatea. He's very jealous of her love for Acis, the shepherd boy, and he basically murders Acis by crushing him with rocks. And where Acis's blood bubbles up from beneath these rocks, it turns into a stream which flows down the mountain and into the sea. And so what Galatea does is she follows it, she goes back to the sea, submerges herself underneath the ocean and never comes up again. So you have the tragedy of her immersing herself in her dead lover, in his watery soul, as it were. And then you have Polyphemus standing on the shore, forevermore doomed to look out over these grey waves, desperately hoping that the woman he loves will rise up from the sea, and she never does. So you have that tragedy of lost love, unrequited love, somebody submerging themselves from reality and hiding away from real life, and that became the theme that I based the Somnambulist on, which is about a young girl who grows up in a house of 3 women who doesn't really know her true past, and one of those women is submerging her own passion and past, another one is keeping them all submerged, and Phoebe, my somnambulist, as it were, my sleepwalker, begins to sleepwalk through a fate of finding out who she is and what she is. And that's my inspiration.
And I so loved hearing that story. See, I just find it illuminates the stories in such fascinating ways. Now, Jessie, I have a dear writer friend called Juliet Marilia, who's actually here in the audience today. Juliet is one of my all-time favourite writers, and we love the same sort of books. And she messaged me a few weeks ago going, Kate, I've just read this amazing book called The Miniaturist. It's so your kind of book, you must read it. And so I, of course, being an obedient girl, went out and bought it straight away. And that was before I knew that I was going to be on a panel with you. And so how about that for serendipity?
Yeah.
It worked perfectly. So I'm in the midst of reading your book at the moment, and I'm so loving it. And I, again, would very much like to know, what was the very first seeds of the story for you?
Thank you very much. That's lovely. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliet.
Thank you. So the reason The Miniaturist came about was I was in Amsterdam on a brief trip, and I'd never been there before, and I went to the Rijksmuseum. And it was there that I saw Petronella Altman's doll's house, which is the sort of central symbol of The Miniaturist. It was built in 1686 and took about 19 years to complete. And it's a completely breathtaking piece of decorative art. It's about 8 feet high. It's very wide as well, and it's made of oak and elm. It's veneered in tortoiseshell. It's shot through with pewter. It also cost the same amount to build and furnish as a real full-blown townhouse. So first off, I was just mesmerised visually by this thing. It was 9 rooms. She had picked her 9 best rooms of her house. So it was sort of best foot forward, best sort of public showing of her existence. And it was, so that, marvelled me. But then it was when I found out she'd spent that much money, I was really intrigued, because I just wanted to kind of understand, I suppose, why somebody would do that. Why would you buy chairs that you can't sit on? Why would you buy food you can't eat and rooms that you can't exist in, and yet feel in some way that you are existing in them in a metaphysical sense? You are telling some other kind of story that perhaps you can't tell in your real life. And it was that sort of distance between that yearning for something that I wanted to investigate. I was also thrilled to discover that anything she had in full size, she would have shipped over. So say she had Japanese or Indonesian silk screens or Japanese porcelain, she would have them miniaturized and shipped over with the Dutch East India Company. So again, this kind of enormous expenditure and ostentation for something so intricate and intimate. And that was really the beginning. And then I just looked into the society and found this marvelous set of contradictions, because Amsterdam at the time was incredibly wealthy, and yet it still, by 1686, did have its sort of Calvinist hangover. There was a reactionary streak against this great wealth and luck, and it was a constant sort of, I suppose, cajoling them to remember not to be complacent and not to sort of rest on their laurels. There was a lot of iconography of tsunamis and people drowning and, mottos and sort of, I can't remember the word, when you're sort of, well, I suppose mottos, morality tales when you're trying to sort of tell people not to, things can change, every man is the architect of his own fortune. All these sort of little mottos that I discovered ended up in the novel. So it was just that interesting house, and then this very fascinating society, which was this jumble of contradictions.
Thank you so much. Diana, I'd like to move to you now, and what I'd really like to know is what do you think sparked your fascination and your interest in this area of study, and were there any fascinating and unexpected serendipities that in your life's journey towards, your area of work now?
Can you all hear me? Can you hear me at the back? Yes. I think it started because there was a disjunction between what I was reading for pleasure and what I was reading in school, in literature classes, in history classes, and then when I went on to become an academic, again there was this disjunction between what I read for pleasure and what I worked on. And in school I read the canonical texts, Wordsworth, Keats, Shelley, Milton, those kinds of big male texts. And in history we did politics and we did kings and so on. But at home what I was reading was historical fiction to a very large extent, and I was reading it partly because that was what my mother read, and I think this may be something that's common to a lot of people. My mother's books were in the house, and she read things like Georgette Hare and Jean Plaidy, so I picked those books up and I read them. But I became aware that this was something that I shouldn't really be reading. It was a slightly guilty secret that this was what I was reading on the quiet. A.S. Byatt is really interesting about this because she talks about reading Georgette Hare on the quiet and becoming a member of the library committee at her school so she could get more copies of Georgette Hare books. And I think there's an interesting line from her reading of that through to Possession, for instance. And you can see that Possession is a kind of Georgette Hare novel in some ways. So there was that disjunction between the serious reading and the serious history that I was studying and what I was actually reading for pleasure. And I wanted to kind of bring those two things together. And it was also partly annoyance, anger, I suppose, that these books by women were being dismissed. And you still get that today. David Starkey, for instance, has been very rude, offensive, I would say, about Philippa Gregory's novels. He talks about them as the Mills and Boonification of history. He really doesn't like them. And there is still that snobbery, I think, about women's writing and about the ways in which women write history as romance or as myth or as fairy tale. So it was partly to do with all those kinds of things coming together, and that was why I started to think about these books, to take them seriously and to think about the ways in which women's historical fiction can fill in the gaps in history. History is about men, about politics, about popes and emperors, about battles, about conflict, Vikings waving big axes, that kind of thing. What happens when you tell those stories from the other side, from the perspective of the woman who's being raped, for instance? What happens? That's what the kind of thing that Naomi Mitchison does, I think, very well. What happens when you look at the blanks and try and fill them in? And that, I think, is what historical fiction can do brilliantly for women, because they've been left out of those traditional accounts of history.
Oh, I so agree with you, and I so agree with you about Georgette Hare as well. My grandmother had the entire collection, and I can remember lying on the carpet in her living room, just reading my way through them all. My sister and I fought over the Georgette Hare collection, and she insisted she had to have some, so I had to go and replace them, so I have the full collection. And just kind of riffing off that as well, if women's historical fiction is sometimes suffers from a kind of literary snobbishness, what about fantasy? And what about the fantastical? I mean, I think of all genres of fiction, I think that probably suffers the most snobbery. And so for someone who likes to write in that borderland between history and myth and fairy tale. It's something that I personally have come across quite a few times. Has anyone else ever suffered from that?
I think that the whole question of the sort of feminization of genres is really an interesting one, because I do think that's part of the problem. And now that what's happened oddly is that fantasy is sort of fractured into all these subgenres. So now you have sort of epic fantasy, which is, the descendants of Tolkien, and that's sort of serious. But then there's all these other kinds that then become sort of lesser by comparison. So if you don't write epic fantasy, you're somehow, so it's just amazing to me how often we just want to subdivide, recategorize, and I think it's in an effort to sort of make parts of that whole, somehow seen as lesser in comparison, easier. And what I would say to anyone, including David Starkey, is that, if you think it's so easy, you should try it.
Yes.
Because, again, this is, as someone who has been training as a historian or been a historian for 30 years and a novelist for 6, I don't know how any of you do it who haven't actually had 30 years. I'm just amazed, because it is so very difficult to get that mix of historical content, accuracy, imagination right. It's just, it's not easy, and I think academics should really stop standing in the ivory tower and throwing rocks outside at the people outside it. So.
And also I'd like to say something there, is that I think that when you say all that time spent in research and getting to know your subject, that's so vital. But one of the most vital things as well when you come to tell a story, because a novel is a story, and that's the most important thing, is that you have to wear that research lightly at times, and condense and condense and condense. And it's almost like homeopathy, is that you just condense it down and you take the essence of what really matters to your story, and the themes, perhaps, that you decide are important to your story. And I think going back to Starkey and ideas about feminism and things like that are very important. And I always try within my stories, particularly I think perhaps with the second one, Elijah's Mermaid, which is very much based from one point of view in a brothel, in a Victorian brothel. And it's not quite the end game that you might imagine it's going to be in the novel itself. But I do think it's very important that the whole aspect of women's lives in that time is so important, because you have the angels of the hearth, which is how women were put on a pedestal almost and revered as being pure and wonderful. And this has a lot to do with Victoria and Albert, and this whole idea of marriage being this perfect golden brand. But in Victorian times, when London was very much smaller than it is today, you had about 80,000 prostitutes, just at a guess, on the streets. And those women had to come from somewhere, and they had to be doing that for some reason. And, it's very easy for us to judge now the fact that people also sold their children. But flesh was a commodity, and also mortality rates are very high. So if your husband or the woman in the family died and couldn't provide for that family, what did you have to sell? What was the lesser evil if you had to support your family and have a roof and food in their mouths, and they weren't going to die of starvation or be kicked onto the streets? So that whole issue I tried to look into, how women were objectified as being perfect, beautiful creatures, but also crushed in the gutter, as it were. And so you can look into things like that with historical fiction. I think you can really develop all those issues, can't you? So many issues.
Is there anything that you'd like to say?
Well, I was just thinking about probably why David Starkey and historians like that are always so dismissive, is because they're just a bit frightened, because I think novels have always been more subversive, and they just hit the bloodstream quicker than a didactic exercise. And I think that's why, and I'm sure that there are many people out there who take their Thomas Cromwell history lessons from Hilary Mantel, and that's what David Starkey doesn't like. Because she did so much research. What was her research different to what he did? And she just has that ability to present it in a much, much, much more mesmerising fashion. And I think it should never be undervalued, and it would just be so amazing if one day that Wolf Hall ends up on the syllabus for A-level history. But yes, I mean, I think it's always, that's an ongoing conversation always, but yeah.
I always say that historical fiction is history set to music, you know, because that to me is you know, historians and historical fiction writers, we share a love of history, we share fascination with the past, and we share, you know, a desire to explore and illuminate the past. And so the primary difference is that historical fiction writers are playing with it and are making an art form out of it, rather than presenting it only for elucidation. Is there anything that you'd like to add to that, Diana?
Going back to David Starkey, in fact. When he made his remarks about not Hilary Mantel, about Philippa Gregory, what he was actually doing, I think, was garnering publicity for his own television series. And he knew that if he made these kinds of comments, people would respond to them, and this would garner interest in the media and so on. And feminist historians quite rightly hit back at him. But it did give him an awful lot of publicity. But one of the things that interests me is that tension between fact and fiction, and how anxious people sometimes get about it. Historical fiction is a kind of oxymoronic genre in that history is about fact, fiction is by its very nature about lies. And when you bring those two things together, you get something really very interesting, but you also get something that some people get very anxious about. And David Starkey seems to be one of those people who gets anxious about it. But you can trace that whole debate right back to Walter Scott. And in the introductory to Waverley, which is so often taken as the first historical novel, 1814, he actually sets out his stall. And again, like David Starkey, he's kind of doing a PR job. He's saying, this is the kind of novel I'm going to write. It's going to be more about men than manners. And I'm not going to write one of those kind of Gothic novels that the women have been doing, or one of those sentimental romances. So if you read the introductory to Waverley, it's quite fascinating in the way that he's kind of setting out his stall and saying, this is the kind of novel that we should be writing about history. We shouldn't be using the supernatural, for instance. And then, of course, he goes on, he uses the supernatural himself in other novels. But he's very clearly gendering the genre there and saying that historical novels should be about certain kinds of things, and by implication then dismissing, say, Anne Radcliffe or Sophia Lee, who had gone before him. Anne Radcliffe's Gothic novels are, of course, set in the past. They are historical novels. The Gothic novel originally was defined by the fact that it was set in the past. It's only later on that it becomes defined by the supernatural and by fear and terror. So I think that kind of tension between fact and fiction, and the way the supernatural and myth and legend all play into that, is really quite a fascinating one, and very, very gendered.
I find it absolutely fascinating. Tolkien said that history often resembles myth because they are the same stuff. And I thought that would be really interesting to talk a little bit about that. Are history and myth the same stuff? And if so, why aren't we using myth more?
Well, I think we do use myth. I think sometimes unconsciously, because so many myths are around us. But what I've done particularly in some of the novels is I've actually, taking back to your point a little bit as well about fiction not supposed to be the truth of things. What I've done is I have my stories, which I suppose are quite Gothic, Victorian stories, but in nearly every one I've taken fictions from the era, real fictions. So, for instance, I've taken the Little Mermaid story in Elijah's Mermaid, and also I've taken The Water Babies by Charles Kingsley, because if you read both of those, they're not pretty stories. They're actually, both of them are actually expressing truths about the human lives. The Water Babies was very much a socialist political tract about children working up chimneys and about unfairness and social inequality, and it's all dressed up in a very pretty, or seemingly pretty story, but it's actually very dark, and it's very sinister, I think, and a lot again of the moral lessons, the do as you would be done bys and all things like that. When we read them now, it's so strict, and it's so rigid, it's so Victorian, but actually those truths are very interesting, and I've applied those to the novel. And then The Little Mermaid as well, which very often we now think of in that Disney way. It's not a lovely, happy story. It's a very, very sad story. And the whole idea, again, very feminist, the whole idea, walking on knives to try and get your freedom, and how difficult that is and how hard won that is. So I think things like that are very interesting, to take the stories, the contemporary stories, which were based in the historical era that you're looking at, and to read those as well as reading the history when you do your research. In my latest novel, The Goddess and the Thief, I took Hindu myths. But it was very interesting to me when I was looking into those Hindu myths, how a lot of them linked in with ideas about vampires and blood cults, and how the whole blood cults and all of that, travels all across the world. We think it's European or whatever, but India has stories about vampires as well, vampires who live in burial grounds and in trees. And then I discovered about this real sect, this real Hindu sect that still exists today, that is still going on, who are a blood cult. And they worship the god Shiva, but they live in burial grounds, and they all, part of their sort of introduction into the cult is they have to find a human skull, they have to drink blood from that human skull. It's all rather horrific, but it's
fascinating.
A gift to a novelist in a way that you can take these things which are so lurid and rather gruesome and horrible, but you can apply them to other stories. So I was looking at Varney the vampire as well in the Penny Dreadfuls, which came years and years and years before Dracula and the Undead.
Do either of you have anything to add to that? Any thoughts?
Well, what I find really interesting is the way that, first of all, I tend not to see history as the production of facts, or that it is about facts. And I think most serious historians would actually find that an odd definition. And so for me, what it's about is trying to figure out with myth, what are the sort of the nuggets of truth or experience or real life events that inform those myths. And so that's one of the conceits of the All Souls trilogy, is to have, a real witch and a real vampire who have to deal with the fact that human beings have made up very silly stories about them over time. And that there's a grain of truth in all of those stories, but that those myths are not, in fact, exactly true. So to sort of, what is it to be a mythic being, in the sense that you have inspired these tales that humans tell, and you know that they're not actually true entirely. They have elements of truth. And that's, again, that's what I see as the job of history, is to try to sift through and figure out what those elements of truth are, knowing that truth is highly contingent, and it's not the same in all times and places, and that it's an interpretation, and that your idea of truth might change, and it's not a sort of philosophical pure truth. But again, it's that sense that history, myth, fiction is really very much in a similar sort of world. That these are not as far distant as we might sometimes want to make them. So.
Now, I think that we could stay here for hours and chit and chat and never get to the end of this fascinating subject, but I'm sure that there are some of you in the audience that would love a chance to ask some questions. Yes?
Is it the sense of the panel that only women can write historical fiction about?
The question was, I believe, is it the belief of the panel that only women can write historical fiction?
About women.
About women. Well, I certainly don't believe that. Does anyone else believe that?
I think if you read Michel Faber, the crimson petal and the white, I think you can see there that, you know, men can certainly do it in lots and lots of ways. And I think G.R.R. Martin, that's fantasy. I know historical fantasy, bringing in so many elements, but I think he's almost Dickensian. You know, characterization, male or female, is so vivid. And either you have that gift or you don't. And I don't think there's anything to do. Otherwise, you know, how would women write from a male perspective? And they very often do, as in the case of, you know, with Cromwell. So, Hilary Mantel. So, yeah, you know.
I was curious about that because I have an entire series about Civil War spies, and they're all female.
Oh, well, good on you. Yes.
Oh, well, this is following on from this, and I noticed that the panel is entirely female panel. But of course, the genre of the reference to Walter Scott was a male one, and when we're talking about fantasy and that, an enormous amount of fantasy is really male fantasies about women. And most extreme, of course, is the witchcraft scare. So all the more sinister and frightening ones are largely seem to be about frightening women. And it's the men who are trying to escape from it by burning them at the stake. But not just elderly women, you know, enchantresses and fairies and this sort of thing. So there's in some way, the modern thing is women taming this. Because I noticed in Deborah Harkness, you know, the witch becomes a non-threatening figure. She's an ally, isn't she? But this is.
I don't know if I'd want to meet her if she was angry in an alley at night. But I think also it's important to realize that the witchcraft scare was not, in fact, manufactured by men. That it was as authored as much by women as by men. And that it's all, you know, all of these creatures are monsters to think with. They're places where we park at you know, our cultural anxieties. There have been witches for millennia. And when you look at witchcraft literature over time, what's amazing is how the witch is not always the same, and it reflects the cultural anxieties of the period that the witch is sort of shaped in. And what they're mostly about is, I think, you know, not only cultural ambivalence about gender, but also about power. You know, one of the things that's fascinating is that in the Russian tradition, very few women are accused of witchcraft because it was just culturally not seen as being a woman couldn't be conceptualized as being that powerful and dangerous. So I think it's all very, you know, it's not as static as we might wish it to be, but yeah.
Can I also add what I found quite interesting when I was doing some research into Indian myths, linking on from what you're saying? It's really interesting in the Indian tradition of these folk stories, as it were, about gods and goddesses, how very often the goddesses embody the perfect, beautiful, feminine, the male fantasy, as it were. But so many of them have other incarnations. When, you know, Parvati one is like the perfect wife, but then can become Durga, who is the warrior who rides on the back of a tiger, who has, you know, all these arms, and every arm has a different weapon, and she's a woman of war. And also when you were talking about Vikings, and they've just realised, haven't they, that a lot of the Viking corpses are actually half female. That this has just come out recently from looking at the DNA research, is that an awful lot of those warriors were actually women. So maybe somebody wants to take that and run with it with a novel.
Oh, we have a question just here.
Yeah, can I ask particularly Deborah about the embodiment of wisdom and knowledge? I mean, the Book of Life sort of enters into Diana's body, and on the other hand, her wisdom in the form of a dragon flies around the village and disappears somewhere else in the end. Strange things at the physical level as well as a mental level.
I just, you know, part of the reason I wrote the books was because I teach very bright, very talented young women who are trying desperately to be invisible for most of the time they're in my classroom. And who, you know, again, contrary to those books on the wall, seem to be very ambivalent about power and owning their own power and feeling comfortable with it. And so the best way that I could think of to have Diana fully possess her power was to embody it, was to have it in every molecule of her being. And so that was why I chose to sort of have her undergo that kind of a transformation. Because I think, you know, what I always tell my students is that power isn't a thing. You don't pick power up and put power down. Power is a set of relationships, and it's something that even if it's a relationship that you have to have with yourself, which is the case of Diana. So.
Well, thank you so much. I'm afraid that we are. Thank you. We are very sadly out of time, and I'm sure that many of you have more questions you would like to ask, but all of the writers will be available. Their books are for sale in the Waterstones pop-up bookstore, and they will be signing their books at some point. So, please come up, speak to all of the authors, and ask them all your burning questions. And thank you for being such a wonderful audience. Thank you.